Welcome back. I am Kathy Brasby, and we will continue our study of the book of Daniel as we dive into chapter 7. We won't finish the chapter today. First, I want to do a review of the first 6 chapters. Sometimes that helps us to take that longer view if we look again at what we've been studying. If you'll recall, chapter 1, we see God's people in exile in a strange and powerful empire. We meet Daniel, a faithful young man of God, who proposes a food test. And in that test, God reveals that he takes better care of his people than the powerful king could do. In chapter 2, we continue to see this powerful empire, and the king has a dream, which God allows Daniel, who, remember, is a very lowly Israelite in exile. God allows Daniel to interpret that dream. And in the dream, God is seen destroying powerful empires. Again, we see that conflict between these empires and God. In chapter 3, we visit Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who they face a great test when Nebuchadnezzar, this powerful king, comes up with an odd plan: bow down and worship a golden statue. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to worship anything except the one true God. For that, they're thrown into the fiery furnace, and God miraculously protects them. We see that same theme again. God is able to protect his faithful even in the midst of a powerful king and empire. In chapter 4, we look at this powerful king Nebuchadnezzar, who loses his mind for a while after boasting about his kingdom's glory and grandeur. He becomes like an animal for a time, but then is restored. We learn again in chapter 4 that God is able to humble even this powerful king. In chapter 5, we met Belshazzar, who was a proud and foolish king who did not learn from the lessons of his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. We saw the hand of God writing judgment on the wall, and Belshazzar, a proud and powerful king, is removed from his throne and his empire taken away by God. Again, we see this conflict between God and these powerful empires. In chapter 6, we met Darius, a new king. We remember he was tricked into signing a law that required everyone to pray only to him. Now, Daniel chooses to continue to pray to God rather than to Darius, and is thrown into this den of lions. The lesson that we learn here is that God protects Daniel. God is more powerful than a king's decree. I want you to notice that in chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar acts like an animal. Then in chapter 6, Daniel is thrown into a den of lions. I want you to remember those animals. We'll revisit those shortly. The Israelites in exile would have found those 6 stories that we've already read in Daniel to be very encouraging. They had to wonder, in exile, had God abandoned them? Was evil winning? Could God do anything about a powerful and evil empire that they were surrounded in? Where was God in the chaos? They found the answer that God is greater than the chaos. In the same way, these stories may resonate with us today. In a sense, we are also in exile. We live in strange and evil times. Sometimes it feels like there is chaos and trouble everywhere. We may ask the same kinds of questions that these Israelites asked. Where is God? How can God allow evil to happen? How can he allow the chaos to continue? Are these evil empires greater than God? Daniel addresses these kinds of questions. So let's jump into Daniel 7. Take a look at this crazy, wild dream that Daniel had. Daniel 7:1. Earlier, during the first year of King Belshazzar's reign in Babylon, Daniel had a dream and saw visions as he lay in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and this is what he saw. In verse 1, we see that during Belshazzar's reign, Daniel himself sees dreams and visions as he lay in bed. We have seen dreams and visions other times in the book of Daniel, and we see some connection from Daniel's dream here back to those. For example, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that he wouldn't tell his advisors. We saw there in 2:28, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. Now I will tell you your dream and the visions you saw as you lay on your bed. This is Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. There are some elements that are in common with Daniel's own dream, including the idea of laying on his bed or in his bed. In chapter 2, Daniel confirms that God reveals secrets. Also, chapter 2 reminds us that it is God who uses dreams and visions to tell what will happen in the future. Both the dreams in chapter 2 and chapter 4 were about something that would happen in the future. We see similar wording in chapter 4. Verse 5, but one night I had a dream that frightened me. I saw visions that terrified me as I lay in my bed. This is from Nebuchadnezzar. And the idea is repeated, a dream. But this time a dream that terrifies and frightens. And again, as I lay in my bed, like Daniel's dream, that pattern is intentional. One last note, Belshazzar was king about 550 BC. We know that from historical documents. That helps us anchor the story. Let's take a look at verse 2 as Daniel continues to describe his dream. In my vision that night, I, Daniel, saw a great storm churning the surface of a great sea, with strong winds blowing from every direction. There's some pretty powerful imagery in that. We have 4 winds blowing from every direction. That instantly tells us that this is imagery. This is like some kind of a symbol or something. It is not literal because a wind doesn't blow from 4 directions at once. Something else, and here we're going to meet apocalyptic numbers. We see the 4. 4 stands for completeness. We have 4 winds. Shortly we will see 4 animals. That completeness. For these ancients, the sea represented chaos or evil or monsters battling God. They're forces challenging God's rule. And so we will see a parallel between the sea and that idea of chaos and evil. We will see a parallel with these kingdoms that are hostile to God and Israel. This dream or vision deals with supernatural forces. The sea is seen as these forces that oppose God, that are trying to disrupt and overwhelm order. We see these animals that we will meet shortly as threatening, as this energy that is opposing good and certainly opposing the power of God. These ancient people would read this idea of the sea as a force that was opposing God, that was raging against the beneficial order of creation itself. Let's meet these 4 beasts. Verse 3. Then 4 huge beasts came out of the water, each different from the others. So we have here in Daniel's vision this idea of beasts and the sea. We have animal imagery. I've tried to find some pictures of ancient architecture or drawings to illustrate what Daniel may have seen in that world around him. For example, here is a Babylonian cloth showing the god of chaos. We see here a depiction of a Babylonian lion king. This shows a Babylonian battle between two gods. Here is a Babylonian bird god with an eagle head, body of a man, plus wings. Now these pictures aren't exactly what Daniel saw in his vision as far as we know, but it does give us an idea of the world that Daniel lived in. Each of these animals is different from the others, and we'll learn later in the chapter that they represent earthly kingdoms. Something we will notice about these beasts is that they are bizarre, mutants. They're perversions of what God intended for His creation. They produce horror and revulsion, and it's combining animal elements and human elements in a monstrous kind of way. The Israelite readers of this story would have had grotesque horror at these beasts. So, let's take a look at the first beast. The first beast was like a lion with eagle's wings. As I watched, its wings were pulled off and it was left standing with its two hind feet on the ground like a human being, and it was given a human mind. This idea of a winged lion with human face was common in Near Eastern art. Many ancient empires saw the eagle as the noblest of birds and the lion as the noblest of animals. So they were drawing those two images together. Historically, Nebuchadnezzar was compared to a lion and his armies to an eagle. So it's likely that this imagery was pointing toward Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Also, this verse parallels with chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar was reduced to an animal and then restored. We see the wings in verse 4 were pulled off. This is like a loss of power, and that actually prepares this creature for transformation into human form. The wings were pulled off. This is a loss of power, but it also prepares Nebuchadnezzar for a transformation back into human form. First the wings are taken off, then this creature is lifted up to two legs. The idea of being restored to a human form as God restores this king to his place of honor. So this first image gives us an idea of how the king was changed from a winged lion to a lion rampart, which you've seen pictures of, also familiar in Mesopotamian art. Then we are told that this beast was given a human mind, perhaps an allusion to Nebuchadnezzar's restoration as he became a beast and then was restored to his throne. This actually was a positive comment on this first beast. As a child, we had limited number of TV stations. As my kids like to say, the weather was given by dinosaurs. Anyway, it was more common to have technical difficulties in those days. And they'd put up an image, kind of like this. And so I have to admit, I had some technical difficulties, and this second part of the class will look slightly different, but bear with me. We will continue on. Verse 5. Then I saw a second beast, and it looked like a bear. It was rearing up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And I heard a voice saying to it, "Get up, devour the flesh of many people." Now we know today that a bear is a powerful animal, a carnivorous animal, frightening animal for the most part. We've heard stories of powerful, frightening grizzly bears or polar bears, something like that, that can be quite dangerous. So we have this image of a bear, this powerful image. It's raised up on one side, we think. This is a tricky interpretation when you go back to the original language. And so we don't know if it's kind of tilted over with one front leg raised. Possibly it's raised up on both back legs. We're not totally sure. We know, however, that the bear in the dream is designed to teach something and illustrate something. Now, the rabbinic tradition is that the bear represents Persia, which never perpetrated any cruelty against Israel. Here's a funny balance to that. Maybe the bear represented the cruelty of Persia. That's another theory. It might represent in some way the division of the Medes and the Persians, or it may just remind us of a bear ready to attack, and that could symbolize kingdoms ready to attack other kingdoms. So then we have the 3 ribs. Possibly the interpretation could be 3 legs. The language is tricky throughout this section of Daniel. Now, some say that these 3 ribs were assigned to 3 kingdoms. You need to know that most scholars can't find enough evidence to give this serious credence. There are some that suggest that these ribs or legs are some kind of a weird anomaly growing out of the bear's mouth. As we've been talking about odd animal anomalies, perhaps this is another one. The idea of the bear getting up and devouring flesh may speak to the kingdom of the Medes, who rose up and overcame the kingdom of Babylon. It may historically be an image of that event. But there is a great deal of debate on which ancient kingdoms are represented. You can spend weeks on the internet studying this stuff, and you may not come away with a clear idea of exactly what is meant, which I think is actually okay. The purpose is not so much writing history in advance as making a theological statement about the conflict between human evil and God. So these odd animals, this odd dream, really centers more on the battle between human evil and God than it's concerned with specific human kingdoms. Even today we have application because we certainly see a conflict between human evil and God yet today. The bear may be less about identifying a specific kingdom and more about telling us there will be evil empire following evil empire to the end of time. Daniel 7:6. Then the third of these strange beasts appeared, and it looked like a leopard. It had 4 birds' wings on its back, and it had 4 heads. Great authority was given to this beast. Now, as we look at these kind of hybrid, odd animals, we need to remember that for the Israelites, the original reader of this dream and story, these hybrid beasts would be unclean and off limits to God's people. You can look in Leviticus, you can look in Deuteronomy, you can see more specifically what I'm talking about. The ancients would look at this kind of an anomaly as an omen from the gods that needed some sort of an interpretation. That's probably part of the reason God wanted the Israelites to stay away from this whole idea of hybrid animals, anomalies. We still have them occasionally today. I know of a museum not too far from us where there's the body of a 2-headed calf. And we hear other stories of animals born in odd ways like that. The ancients would see those as omens, in some way that the gods were trying to speak something to the people. Now, Daniel would have been aware of this kind of imagery, and the need for interpreting an omen would not have endorsed it as a believer of God. But let's look further at this leopard. This leopard is powerful again, and it is fast. It is winged, which helps that speed, that moving quickly. Now, the idea of 4 wings, 4 heads, again, first, it's an anomaly. It's an odd thing. There are no actual leopards created by God that look like this. So we know this is some kind of symbol. The 4 heads, 4 wings, that idea of 4 represent completeness. So this drawing gives us a rough idea of what this animal may have looked like. As we look at these 4 wings, 4 heads, those could possibly indicate the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire. It could just mean that the leopard could see in all directions and move in all directions quickly, which would be a pretty amazing image of an evil kingdom just overthrowing an area, armies going out quickly. It could represent the 4 corners of the earth, that idea of 4 again, and an idea of a universal empire that perhaps was huge. I mean, in the day of Jesus, the Roman Empire would have been thought of as a universal empire. And certainly the Romans knew how to move quickly to overcome an area. So we could get a picture here of yet another evil kingdom. Oddly enough, this strange leopard is given great authority or sovereignty. It may go back to chapter 2 of Daniel when we saw that statue which represented different kingdoms. These kingdoms for a time had great authority, but eventually they were all crushed. Something worse comes now in the dream. So let's look at verse 7. Then in my vision that night I saw a 4th beast, terrifying, dreadful, and very strong. It devoured and crushed its victims with huge iron teeth and trampled their remains beneath its feet. It was different from any of the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. This 4th beast is overwhelming. It is terrifying. It is powerful. It is vicious and violent. We see those iron teeth that crush and devour its victims. In the Old Testament, a horn symbolized power. Think of the horn that they would blow at the beginning of a battle, for example. Not just the horn that's on an animal, but a horn represents power, possibly kind of a military type imagery. So these 10 horns, this completeness, this fullness represents power, great power. This animal is almost a hybrid between an animal and a machine, almost a robo-beast kind of idea. So powerful, just mowing down anything in its way. If we try and attach this beast to a specific ancient kingdom, if the first animal was Babylon, then the bear was Mede, then the leopard was Persia, then this beast is Greece. If, however, we stack these kingdoms differently, then the lion could be Babylon, the bear could be Medes, Persians combined, then the leopard could be the Greeks, and now this beast could be the Romans. A key thing to remember in this is that it could be applied to several different evil empires. The iron teeth remind us of that statue in chapter 2. If you recall, they represented different kingdoms and there were different metals and layers in this statue. The legs and the feet were made of iron and clay, and this great rock crushed those legs and destroyed the statue. This statue was kingdoms. The rock was God. We also remember that iron was used in weapons, one of its major uses. So it's not hard to see this beast as something violent and powerful and sinister, and we certainly can see forces of evil in this. Bottom line, this is a terrifying description of an evil kingdom. Verse 8. As I was looking at the horns, suddenly another small horn appeared among them. 3 of the first horns were torn out by the roots to make room for it. This little horn had eyes like human eyes and a mouth that was boasting arrogantly. We react strongly emotionally toward this cocky little arrogant beast. we see that it is really representing a human. It has human eyes, it can speak. We see those human attributes in it. It would be typical of a human empire just exalting itself with arrogance and just that prancing and cockiness of it. In the time of Jesus, we could imagine a number of Roman Caesars that would fit this description. But if we dug a little deeper, further back in history, we could see Greek kings that also fit this. And to be honest, if we looked more modern, we can certainly see a number of arrogant, cocky emperors and kings that this could apply to. This character is almost cartoon-like. We see that hissing and that gloating and that prancing around. Remember again, the horn equals power. So this little emperor at one time had great power and certainly believes it has unlimited power maybe. We see the mouth can be arrogance and deceit, flattery. So this particular vision is a comment on evil, arrogant, violent, powerful rulers. So we have our beasts over here, from the lion and the bear and the leopard, and now this robo-beast, representing different evil empires. It's almost a boxing imagery. In this corner, we have these beasts and these evil empires represented in different ways. Now, in this corner, we're going to see something different. So let's take a look at verses 9 and 10. I watched as thrones were put in place, and the Ancient One sat down to judge. His clothing was as white as snow, his hair like purest wool. He sat on a fiery throne with wheels of blazing fire, and a river of fire was pouring out, flowing from his presence. Millions of angels ministered to him. Many millions stood to attend him. Then the court began its session, and the books were opened. So the scene is changing now. It's almost like the camera has moved from over here with his evil, weird anomalies, and now we move to really a very comforting scene, I think. We are in the throne room of the divine council. So we see this council convenes, and they're sitting in judgment. I want you to think of more like a trial setting. They come in, and the judge sits down in his or her raised seat. Here we have God sitting on this judgment seat. We see a king, really, with his council. That name of the Ancient Ones, it refers to eternal existence. And this is in contrast to the temporary state of these beasts and evil kingdoms. That is one of the powerful themes of the book of Daniel, really, is eternal nature of the Ancient One compared to the temporary state of the evil kingdoms. So the Ancient One sits down to judge. His clothing is white as snow, his beard is like, his hair is like purest wool. We think of that image of purity. Let's talk for a minute about this fire that we see over and over in these verses. Fiery throne, wheels of blazing fire, a river of fire poured out. This has to do with an appearance of God. I want you to think about Moses meeting the burning bush. Also think about the fire that was on Mount Sinai. Moses went up into the presence of God, spent time with God, received the law. We also remember this pillar of fire that was leading the Israelites through the wilderness. So fire, in part, can tell us about the presence of God. There's another part to fire, and it has to do with just consuming. Psalm 97 talks about fire consuming God's enemies. In verses 3 and 4, we read, "Fire spreads ahead of him and burns up all his foes. His lightning flashes across the world. The earth sees and trembles." We also see in Psalm 50 another image of that, where devouring fire goes before God as he judges his people. In Psalm 50 it says, "Our God approaches and he is not silent. Fire devours everything in his way, and a great storm rages around him. So we understand that fire indicates the presence of God, and it also tells us about God's judgment. Those are useful imageries in this terrifying dream that Daniel has. Another image is the divine chariot. Reminds us of Ezekiel 1. If you want to compare Ezekiel's vision there with Daniel's vision here, we will see similarities between the two. And we are reminded that only God rides the divine chariot. So we should clearly see that this is a divine council with millions of members on this council. It gives you an idea of the power and the authority that we see in this corner. And it is in contrast with these horrible beasts who only think they have complete authority and full power. So the council prepares for judgment. And you remember at the end, the book is open. The scene is set. In this corner is evil. God and his attendants are in this corner. And God is the judge. So let's continue with verses 11 and 12. I continued to watch because I could hear the little horn's boastful speech. I kept watching until the fourth beast was killed and its body was destroyed by fire. The other three beasts had their authority taken from them, but they were allowed to live a little while longer. If we remember that these beasts in this corner are kingdoms, we see that this horrible fourth beast was killed. It was executed by fire. We see judgment of God here. Done quickly, swiftly, boom. The fourth beast is gone. It thought it had full power, but the judgment of God took care of it quickly. The other beasts are similarly treated. They are not treated quite as harshly. They are not killed, but they remain for a little while. They are no longer have the same authority, which gives us a hint of perhaps a submission to God here. But these kingdoms were not as horrible as this fourth one was, and they merely were deprived of their sovereignty. But we can see how swiftly this judgment happens. Fire shoots out almost like lightning, and they are gone. We can see how swiftly this judgment happens. God strikes with fire in this vision, and those opposing him, the evil forces, are consumed. We're going to stop here and continue our study of chapter 4 in the next lesson. There's a lot more to come, and I've given you a lot in this lesson. In part, we will look at the Son of Man. This is a term that Jesus used during his ministry. He used it for himself. And so I think as we study a little more deeply who this Son of Man is in Daniel, it will give us a little connection to Jesus as well. Thank you for being here for this lesson and putting up with my technical difficulty. I hope you'll come back for the next part of chapter 7. Have a wonderful week.